Let's go live to Sydney now. The Shadow Trade Minister Madeleine King joins me now. Thanks so much for your time. The announcement from the Prime Minister yesterday was pondered over for quite some time. Are there any implications, trade or otherwise?
Well, Laura, it's an important decision that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defence has made, in which Labor, through our Shadow Minister for Defence, has supported, with our leader, of course, Anthony Albanese, and Penny Wong as well. Clearly there are implications for global trade in there being disruption to the rights of passage through the Strait of Hormuz, and that is why, among the reasons that Labor supports the government's taking this action, that is why we're doing it, because it is important to support freedom of navigation to ensure this really critical trade route is maintained and is safe for all civilian maritime traffic.
Could there be any negative blowback?
I don't believe so. It's important for our Royal Australian Navy to work with other navies to ensure that there is a freedom of navigation through important trade routes. I've heard the various commentary from different parts of the political spectrum about potential blowback, but I think it's really important that Australia supports what is a real mainstay of the international legal system, which is bound up in the laws of the sea, and part of that is the freedom of navigation aspect.
Closer to home, really, the US and China are well and truly engaged in this trade war. The Morrison government has been handling it so far by saying that leaders need to get together, keep open the dialogue and come to some kind of agreement. Would Labor do anything differently?
Well, I do agree that it is very important that all nations keep open the dialogue. When people are shouting from different platforms, it doesn't really help our international global trading system. We supported the visit of Minister Birmingham to China recently. That was a good start of a good effort to try and engage China more actively in reform of the World Trade Organisation, and that's what Labor would seek to do, and we, to be honest, look forward to working as best we can in a bipartisan fashion to make sure that there is progress in reform of the WTO, so that we might continue to engage the US more positively on reform of this international organisation that has set our trade rules for some time now.
Why do you think China is holding up some coal imports, Australian coal imports, at some of their ports?
Well, I mean, I'm not privy to why that is happening. I regret that it is happening. It's not good for our coal exporters, and I acknowledge that. China does, I'm sure, have its reasons, and I know they're working with senior officials on that. But beyond that, I really can't comment. I do hope that those coal exports, or imports to them, are allowed to transit through shortly. But I will leave that to the experts of DFAT. They're very experienced professional people that act with the best interests of Australian exporters in mind.
You're the alternative government, you're West Australian based. This should be surely very concerning, shouldn't it?
Well, the trade war in general is, of course, very concerning. This is not a good place for any part of the world to be in. Western Australia is particularly vulnerable to international trade. Most of our iron ore goes to China. We engage very positively with the Chinese community, and Western Australia will continue to do so. For that matter, so will Australia, of course. But you are right to say these things are concerning, and we do hope that the government is able to react positively and perhaps develop a more unifying narrative around our relationship with China that, all their own backbenchers can get behind, so that we can support that relationship, as well as being, really aware of the importance of our relationship with the US and, very alive to the issues that arise between both the US and China.
But what do you mean by a more unifying relationship with China? Should we be more or less reliant on China when it comes to trade? Well,
it's an open market in trade, so we trade what we can. So we do have reliance on China, but has developed over many decades of open and free trade, which is what Australia as a trading nation needs. So I would never argue that we should trade less with China. This is a very important relationship, and many small businesses, large businesses, jobs in Australia rely on our relationship with China. Equally, they rely on our relationships with other nations that we trade with.
Well, there are concerns at the moment that Australian universities are too reliant on overseas, high-paying Chinese students. Is that a concern to you?
Well, I worked in the university sector for over 10 years at the University of Western Australia, and what I saw and what I will continue to see is universities do rely on international student fees, and there is a very clear reason for that. They were told by governments to go and find different avenues of revenue to support the activities of a university, which are very expensive. So it shouldn't come as much of a surprise to anyone inside or outside of the higher education sector that universities might be seen to be reliant on international student income.
Is that a problem in your view?
Well, it's a problem because... no, it's not a problem because the international students have every right to come here, and we offer a great educational service, or an education as a whole, and a great ability to learn from a different culture and to grow those person-to-person relationships between whether it's China, Indonesia, Singapore, India and Australia. My concern...
Are you arguing that, you know, that perhaps there should be more federal government funding for universities, therefore they wouldn't have to rely on overseas students?
Absolutely. There should be more government funding for universities. Equally, you've got to... Not many people understand necessarily that the funding of science at universities is a cross-subsidy from the revenue from student income.
Okay,
so
well, 1 in 10
there's also an aspect there of
come
science.
from China in our universities. Is that too high? What level should it be at?
I'm not going to speculate on what level is appropriate for which nations to come and study here. Students are welcome to study here. Each university will set its targets, it will set its markets. For instance, in Western Australia, our market is different. We don't have that kind of proportion of Chinese students because they mostly come to Sydney. So we have a higher number of Singaporean students. So that's really for the market to decide, for the higher education sector to decide. I don't see any need for putting limits on any particular international visitor to Australia.
OK, just quickly and finally, will Labor support the ratification of the Indonesia FTA through the Parliament?
The Indonesia-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement is going through the Parliament at the moment. We know we've got a process to go through the Treaties Committee. Labor is going to wait and see with interest all the submissions that go in to that committee. It's a really very active and thoughtful committee process, and once that has gone through, it's a very fulsome process, as we'll wait for the legislation to come through from the government and we'll consider it at that time.
Also, this has been years of negotiations, hard-fought negotiations, and you're saying there is a chance that Labor will hold it up in Parliament?
Look, as far as I'm aware, the only person that has held up the Indonesia-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement was Scott Morrison when he proposed to move our embassy in Israel. So what I want to make clear is that the Labor Party is a clear supporter of our relationship with Indonesia. It's critically important to the nation. It's critically important to Western Australia. We'll consider this economic partnership agreement as it comes to us, as it goes through the Treaties Committee. We'll consult with many stakeholders and also with caucus members, and we'll listen to the concerns that some people have in relation to some trade agreements, and then we'll make a decision, but we'll make a clear decision, and the people of Australia will know soon enough.